He lay perfectly still on the couch with his eyes closed, his wallet open on the table beside a watch worth more than her mother's entire hospital bill. He was the richest man in the county. She was the housekeeper he had hired 4 days earlier. What she whispered when she thought he was sleeping, he never forgot for the rest of his life. If stories like this move you, take a second to hit subscribe and drop a like for Winter Veil, and stay until the very end, because what happens in the last few minutes of this one, you will not see coming. Winter has always felt like something honest to me, the kind of cold that strips everything down to what's real underneath. In this story, I found myself thinking about how snow doesn't care who you are before it falls on you. Rich or poor, kind or cruel, it settles the same. I hope Emily and Nathaniel's story warms you the way writing it warmed me. The snow had already started falling over Hawthorne Manor by the time Emily Carver walked up the long gravel drive, her boots crunching against the thin white layer that hadn't quite decided whether to stick. She wore a plain gray coat 2 sizes too big, borrowed from her mother's closet, and she had pulled her dark hair into a tight braid so it wouldn't fall into her face. The house rose in front of her like something out of a magazine, stone and glass, and a roofline that seemed to touch the low Vermont clouds. She stood at the iron gate for a moment longer than she needed to, just breathing. 26 years old, and this was the biggest house she had ever been inside of in her life, let alone worked in. She thought of her mother lying in the back bedroom of their small rented house outside Stowe, the oxygen machine humming through the night, the stack of unpaid bills growing on the kitchen counter like something alive. She rang the bell before her nerves could talk her out of it. The woman who opened the door was somewhere in her 60s, silver hair pinned back severely, reading glasses pushed up into it. She looked Emily over once, head to boots, the way someone might inspect a delivery they weren't sure they'd ordered. Her name was Mrs. Abernathy, and she had run this house for 19 years, longer than most of the furniture had been in it. There would be a 30-day trial period, Mrs. Abernathy said, leading Emily through a foyer bigger than her entire apartment. Mr. Graham expected discretion above everything else. No personal conversations with him unless he started them. No questions about his business, his schedule, or his past. And absolutely no gifts accepted from anyone in this house, staff or otherwise, because gifts had a way of becoming debts nobody wanted to collect on later. Emily nodded and said she understood, and she meant it more than Mrs. Abernathy could have known. She had spent most of her adult life trying to be small enough not to be noticed, quiet enough not to be blamed for things. It was a skill she'd learned the hard way, and she carried it into this house the same way she carried everything else, without complaint. Her mother's lungs had started failing 2 winters back, a slow decline no doctor could fully explain beyond years of hard work in a textile plant that had closed down before anyone bothered checking what the air inside it had been doing to the people who breathed it every day. The oxygen machine cost money every month just to keep running. Her younger brother was 3 semesters into a state college scholarship 200 miles away, and Emily had promised herself, that nothing happening at home would ever pull him out of it. So she had learned to disappear into her work the way other people learned instruments or languages, a skill practiced quietly until it became second nature. Being invisible had never felt like a punishment to her. It felt like the only kind of safety she had left, and Hawthorne Manor, cold and enormous and unfamiliar as it was, felt at first like just one more place to practice being nobody in particular. Nathaniel Graham was 39 years old and ran Graham Property Group, a development firm with its name on half the ski resorts and luxury lodges scattered across northern New England. He had dark hair going silver at the temples, a jaw that photographed well in business magazines, and a reputation for being the kind of man who could sit across a negotiating table for 6 hours without blinking. Handsome in the way that made people nervous rather than comfortable, because it seemed like armor rather than an invitation. He was also, according to every member of his household staff, nearly impossible to read. Not cruel, not unfair, just cold, like something behind his composed exterior had been sealed off years ago and nobody had found the key since. Mrs. Abernathy had watched 3 housekeepers come and go in the past 2 years alone, none of them lasting through the trial period, though nobody could quite say why they'd left. Emily started work on a Tuesday in the second week of November, arriving before the sun came up to build fires in rooms nobody used, setting cut flowers on windowsills that hadn't held anything alive in years. She spoke only when spoken to. When Nathaniel passed her in the hallway, she stepped aside and lowered her eyes. The same reflex she'd carried through every job since the incident at the nursing home 2 years back, the one she still couldn't talk about without her hands starting to shake. She barely registered as a presence in that enormous house, and that was exactly what made Nathaniel suspicious of her. He had employed housekeepers who were friendly and stole from him, and housekeepers who worked hard and cut every corner when nobody was watching. But he had never had one who fixed things nobody had asked her to fix, and then said nothing about it at all. A silver vase that had sat tarnished on the mantel for 3 winters turned up polished and gleaming. A window in the east wing that had been painted shut since before Mrs. Abernathy's time swung open easily one morning. A note in careful handwriting appeared by the coffee machine. "We're almost out of cream. Should I pick some up on my next trip into town?" He never answered the notes. He noticed every single one of them. What bothered him most was the money. Roy, the driver who had worked for the family for 11 years and greeted every new hire with a folded $20 bill as a welcome, had his gesture politely declined with a warm smile. Mrs. Abernathy tried tucking an envelope into a stack of folded towels once, an old habit she used to soften new employees into loyalty, and it came back to her the next morning, untouched, with a quiet thank you attached. Nathaniel stood at his study window one evening, turning the pattern over in his mind. People who refused money either had principles or they had a plan, and in his experience the second kind was far more common than the first. Trust to him had never been a matter of instinct. It was a matter of evidence, cold and provable, the same way he evaluated every contract that crossed his desk, and he decided that Emily Carver deserved to be tested properly. On a gray Wednesday afternoon, he staged the living room the way a magician sets a trap nobody sees coming. He left his wallet open on the mahogany table, a scattering of loose bills beside it, and his late father's gold watch resting just close enough to look forgotten rather than displayed. Then he stretched out on the long leather couch, rolled his sleeves up, closed his eyes, and let his breathing fall slow and even, as though sleep had simply taken him mid-afternoon. A hidden camera behind the bookshelf, installed years ago after a break in attempt nobody in the house liked to discuss, recorded everything from a small blinking light nobody ever noticed. He waited. His heart, despite every ounce of control he prided himself on, beat a little faster than he wanted to admit, some old part of him hoping to be wrong about people just this once. Emily's footsteps were soft, and even on the hardwood when she entered, the sound of someone who had learned to move through a house without disturbing it. She paused near the table, and he could feel, even with his eyes shut, the exact moment her gaze landed on the watch, the wallet, the loose bills scattered like an accident. Then, apparently satisfied he was truly asleep, she began cleaning the far side of the room instead, the windowsills where dust had gathered in the corners nobody bothered checking. She worked her way slowly around the room, careful and unhurried, straightening a chair that hadn't needed straightening, wiping baseboards that hadn't been touched in a month. Nathaniel lay still, listening to the quiet rhythm of her work, his chest tightening a little more with every second that passed, and nothing happened to the money on the table. After several long minutes, she finally approached the mahogany table. He braced himself without meaning to. She picked up the watch, but instead of pocketing it, she pulled a soft cloth from her apron pocket and gently polished a smudge from the glass face, setting it back down in the exact same spot, angled exactly as it had been. The cash she never touched at all, sliding a book beside it slightly to dust beneath, then sliding it back into place as though the money were simply air. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Then he heard her cross the room toward him, felt the soft weight of a wool blanket settle gently over his shoulders, her fingers pausing for just a moment at the edge of the fabric. "Sleep well?" she murmured, so quietly he almost missed it. "I've got things covered out here." Nathaniel did not open his eyes. He lay there long after her footsteps faded down the hall, staring at the darkness behind his own closed eyelids, feeling something crack open inside him that he hadn't examined in over a decade, not since the funeral, not since the last time anyone in this house had spoken to him like he was a person worth watching over rather than a name on a company letterhead. In the days that followed, he began noticing her differently, not with the cold calculation of a man running a background check, but with something closer to attention he hadn't given anyone in years. Emily wasn't beautiful in the way that stopped traffic. Her beauty was quieter than that. In the soft way she smiled when Mrs. Abernathy told her something funny, in the way she asked Roy if his knee was bothering him again and actually waited for the answer instead of moving on. He found a note by the espresso machine he never used. The drip valve is a little sticky. I loosened it. Should work fine now. Signed only with a small drawing of a snowflake instead of her name. He found the dusty frame on his desk holding a photograph of his mother, cleaned and repositioned to catch the afternoon light through the west window, exactly where it used to sit before he'd stopped looking at it at all. He stood in front of that photograph longer than he meant to, throat tight, saying nothing to anyone. He didn't confront her about it. He didn't thank her for it either. But something in him had started keeping track of Emily Carver the way he used to keep track of market shifts, quietly, constantly, without fully admitting to himself why it mattered so much. Roy had gone quiet one Friday in late November, the kind of quiet that settled over him every year around the same week, though nobody ever asked why, and he never offered an explanation. Emily noticed it anyway, the way his shoulders sat a little lower than usual as he loaded firewood into the garage, and without saying a word about it, she left a thermos of hot soup on the passenger seat of his truck before her shift ended that evening. He found it an hour later, still warm, with a folded napkin tucked beneath it that read only, "Hope today was gentle with you." Roy sat in that truck a long while before he drove home, and the next morning he told Nathaniel, almost embarrassed by how much it had meant to him, that it was the anniversary of his wife's passing, and that nobody in 11 years of working this house had ever noticed the date without being told. Then came the night he saw her crying. It was nearly midnight, snow falling steady and silent outside the tall windows, when Nathaniel came home later than planned from a meeting that had run long. Passing the glass doors that opened onto the courtyard, he caught sight of a shape hunched on the stone bench beneath the bare maple tree, arms wrapped tight around herself, shoulders shaking in a way she was clearly trying to keep small and silent. He stood behind the glass, unsure what to do with hands that had never learned how to comfort anyone. He wasn't a man people turned to when they were breaking. He had built his entire adult life around not needing that kind of thing from anyone, and somewhere along the way he'd forgotten how to offer it either. He watched her wipe her face hard with both palms and straighten her spine before standing, as if strength was only real when nobody else was around to witness it costing her something. The next morning, before the house had fully woken, Nathaniel made coffee with his own hands for the first time in years. He slid an envelope beneath Emily's cup on the small tray she prepared every morning before anyone else came downstairs. Not charity, he had written in his precise, slanted handwriting, "An advance against your wages, take it." He signed his name and was already behind his study door when she found it. She stood over that envelope a long time before her hands finally stopped shaking enough to open it, checking twice to make sure the kitchen was really empty. The coffee was still warm when she finally sat down and let herself cry a little, this time not from grief, but from something closer to disbelief that kindness like this still existed anywhere in the world she'd learned to be so careful in. It was a Thursday in early December when everything nearly fell apart. Nathaniel had invited a small group of investors to lunch, 5 men and one sharp-eyed woman from a firm in Boston named Diana Sutter, all of them accustomed to the world bending around their schedules. The meal went smoothly until Diana set down her fork midway through dessert and announced she needed to step into the library for a moment to retrieve something she'd forgotten. She returned 3 minutes later, holding a folded silk scarf between 2 fingers like it might be contaminated, laying it deliberately on the table for everyone to see. "I found this tucked behind a book on the shelf," she said, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry, right next to a rather valuable first edition. In fact, one does wonder what a housekeeper's scarf is doing hidden in a room like that. Every head at the table turned toward the small embroidered initial stitched crookedly into the corner of the fabric, an E, the kind of stitching someone teaches themselves rather than learns properly. Nathaniel recognized it instantly. He had seen Emily wear that same scarf on cold mornings walking up the drive. His jaw tightened, but before he could speak, Diana added something sharper, something about how certain people learn to make themselves invisible for reasons worth investigating. An hour later, Mrs. Abernathy stood in the hallway holding the scarf while Emily was called in from the kitchen, her hands still damp from washing dishes. Nathaniel's voice, when he finally asked, was flatter than he intended, stripped of the warmth he'd been building toward her in private for weeks. "Is this yours?" he asked. "Yes," Emily answered quietly. "It must have fallen out of my apron pocket." "Did you place it there deliberately?" he pressed, and her whole face closed like a door swinging shut. She didn't answer right away, and in that silence Nathaniel felt an old, ugly instinct rear up inside him. The same one that had made him test her with cash on a table weeks earlier. The part of him that had never fully believed people were good without a reason. "Why aren't you defending yourself?" he asked, frustration bleeding into his voice now. "Because it never helps," she finally said, so quietly he had to lean in to hear it all. 2 years ago, she explained, she'd worked at a care facility outside Burlington. An elderly patient named Mr. Talbot had suffered a heart attack on her shift, and she'd stayed with him, held his hand until the paramedics arrived, kept him breathing through sheer stubborn will until help came. He survived. A week later, his wedding ring went missing, and it turned up in the laundry cart she used every single day. She never found out how it got there. Nobody asked her version of events twice. They fired her within the hour, and she walked out into a Vermont winter with nothing but a box of her things and a reputation she couldn't fix no matter how loudly she explained herself. Since then, she said, she'd stopped trying to defend herself against accusations, because people believed whatever they'd already decided to believe long before she opened her mouth. The hallway went silent except for the low hum of the furnace somewhere below them. Nathaniel looked at the scarf in Mrs. Abernathy's hands, the crooked embroidered letter, and felt something twist hard in his chest, shame layered over an old habit of suspicion he'd never fully unlearn it. But before he could speak again, his assistant Marcus Riley stepped forward from where he'd been standing quietly by the study door, his expression carefully arranged into concern. "Perhaps," Marcus suggested smoothly, "given the missing petty cash discrepancies from the estate ledger these past few weeks, it might be worth having security review things a bit more thoroughly, just to be safe for everyone involved." Nathaniel frowned. He hadn't heard anything about missing cash. Marcus assured him it was a small matter, nothing worth alarming him over until now. But perhaps, given the timing, it deserved a proper look. What followed was the worst hour of Emily's life. Security was called in discreetly, and she was asked to wait in the cold mudroom off the kitchen while her locker and belongings were searched, snow visible through the frosted window beside her, her breath fogging an air that felt colder than it should have. Nathaniel stood in the doorway of his own home, unsure, in a way he hadn't been in years, which version of the truth he actually believed. Then one of the security men returned holding Emily's canvas work bag open, and inside it, nestled beneath a folded sweater, sat a small brooch, an antique piece set with sapphires that Nathaniel recognized instantly, because it had belonged to his mother, kept in a locked drawer of his study that almost nobody had access to. The room seemed to tilt. Diana Sutter's eyebrows rose with quiet, satisfied vindication. Emily simply went very still and very pale. "I never touched that drawer," Emily said, her voice steady even as her hands trembled at her sides. "I've never even been inside your study when you weren't there." Nathaniel wanted to believe her. Some deep and desperate part of him wanted nothing more in that moment. But the evidence sat right there in front of everyone, cold and undeniable, and 39 years of building his entire life around proof over feeling made his silence stretch a beat too long. "Call the county sheriff's office," Marcus said calmly, already reaching for his phone as though the matter were settled. "This is theft of a family heirloom. This needs to be handled properly and on the record." Emily's face drained of every last bit of color. She thought of her mother alone in that back bedroom with nobody to change her oxygen tank, of the hospital bills that would keep coming whether she was free or in a holding cell, and she felt the ground disappear beneath her feet the same way it had the day they'd walked her out of that care facility. "Wait," Nathaniel said, though even he wasn't entirely sure yet what he was asking Marcus to wait for. Diana folded her arms and reminded him gently, almost kindly, that sentiment was a poor substitute for procedure, that plenty of good men had been made fools of by exactly this kind of hesitation, and that a man in his position could not afford to look like he bent the rules for a pretty face on his household staff. The word pretty landed in the room like something spilled that nobody wanted to clean up. Emily heard it and said nothing, her old instinct rising up automatically, the same silence that had cost her a job and a reputation 2 years earlier. But Nathaniel's whole expression changed when he saw her go quiet like that. Saw her brace for a verdict she'd already decided not to fight. And it was that exact silence, more than the brooch or the ledger or anything Marcus had said, that finally made him stop and truly look at what was happening in his own front hallway. It was Roy who stopped everything. He'd been standing near the garage entrance the whole time, silent, until he finally cleared his throat and said he needed to say something before anyone made a call they couldn't take back. He'd seen Marcus Riley in the mudroom that very morning, alone, nearly 20 minutes before Emily had even arrived for her shift, doing something near the lockers that Roy hadn't thought twice about until just now. Nathaniel's head snapped toward Marcus. "There's a camera in that mudroom, isn't there?" he said slowly. "The same one covering the side entrance for insurance purposes, installed after the break-in years ago." Nobody moved for a long moment. Marcus's carefully composed expression flickered, just barely. But Nathaniel had spent 17 years reading faces across negotiating tables, and he recognized that particular flicker instantly for exactly what it was: fear. They pulled the footage in his study while Emily waited in the hallway outside, Mrs. Abernathy's hand resting firmly on her shoulder the entire time, refusing to leave her side despite 30 years of careful professional distance suddenly meaning nothing at all. The grainy black and white recording showed exactly what Roy had described: Marcus Riley slipping something small into the outer pocket of Emily's bag, checking over his shoulder twice before hurrying away. Nathaniel sat back from the screen, feeling something cold settle over him that had nothing to do with the weather outside. Marcus had been skimming from the estate accounts for over a year, small enough amounts that nobody noticed until Emily, quietly organizing the study one afternoon weeks earlier, had mentioned to Mrs. Abernathy that a few invoice totals didn't quite add up. She'd never said a word to Nathaniel directly. She hadn't wanted to seem like she was overstepping. Marcus had heard about that conversation secondhand and panicked, deciding the surest way to bury his own theft was to bury the person who might eventually uncover it. And the missing brooch had been sitting in that locked drawer for exactly this kind of opportunity. When confronted in the study with the footage playing silently behind him, he didn't bother denying it, just sat down heavily in the chair across from Nathaniel's desk and asked, quietly, "What happens now?" What happened next was that Marcus Riley was escorted from Hawthorne Manor by the same security team that had nearly walked Emily out in handcuffs an hour earlier, and the county sheriff was indeed called, though for an entirely different reason than the one anyone had expected that afternoon. Diana Sutter left without finishing her coffee, offering something between an apology and an excuse that nobody in the room particularly cared to accept. Nathaniel found Emily still sitting in the mudroom afterward, her coat still on, staring at the frost patterns creeping across the window glass like they were the only steady thing left in the world. He sat down across from her without asking permission, which was new for both of them. "I doubted you," he said plainly, no excuses offered alongside it. "And I am more sorry for that than I know how to properly say to you right now." Emily looked at him for a long moment, and something in her chest that had been braced tight for years finally, carefully, began to loosen just slightly. "You didn't call the sheriff yourself?" she said quietly. "That has to count for something." Nathaniel shook his head. "It shouldn't have taken this long to trust you," he said, "and it shouldn't have taken evidence at all. Evidence was never really the problem. I was." The peace lasted exactly 4 days. On the 5th morning, Nathaniel's lawyer called before 8 o'clock to say that Diana Sutter's firm had sent formal notice withdrawing from the resort merger they'd spent 11 months negotiating, citing, in carefully worded corporate language, concerns about workplace conduct irregularities and questionable judgment in personnel matters. It was retaliation dressed up as due diligence, and everyone in the room understood exactly what it really was. By that afternoon, 3 of Graham Property Group's board members had gathered in the main conference room downtown, faces set in the particular grim expression of men who had watched a 9-figure deal evaporate over what they considered, out loud, a housekeeper. One of them, a heavy-set man named Preston who had sat on the board since Nathaniel's father ran the company, said plainly that perhaps it would be wisest, for the sake of the merger and the sake of the firm's reputation, if certain personal arrangements were quietly discontinued. Nathaniel sat at the head of that table and felt something in him that used to bend automatically toward whatever protected the business first. For 17 years that instinct had never once failed him. He looked around at the men who had built careers alongside his father's legacy, all of them waiting for him to do the practical thing, the safe thing, the thing that had always worked before. Then he thought of a wool blanket settled over his shoulders by someone who believed he was asleep and helped him anyway. He thought of a scarf with a crooked embroidered letter, of a woman standing in a cold mudroom refusing to defend herself because the world had taught her it never mattered. He stood up slowly, buttoned his jacket, and told the room that the merger was not worth what they were asking him to trade for it. If Diana Sutter's firm wanted an excuse to walk away, he said, they had clearly been looking for one before any of this happened, and he would rather lose 11 months of negotiations than spend one more day being the kind of man who let good people get thrown away to keep a deal alive. Preston argued for another 20 minutes. Nathaniel let him finish, thanked him for his years of service to the company, and did not change his answer once. The merger collapsed publicly within the week, and for a few days the local business papers ran unflattering speculation about Graham Property Group's leadership and his judgment. Mrs. Abernathy, who almost never offered opinions on business matters, told him quietly over breakfast that his father would have been prouder of him for that decision than for any deal he'd ever closed, and Nathaniel found, to his own surprise, that he believed her completely. Emily heard about all of it secondhand from Roy, and it frightened her more than the accusation itself had. She hadn't asked for any of this, hadn't wanted to become the reason a man lost something he'd spent years building, and she found herself wondering whether staying anywhere near Hawthorne Manor was fair to anyone at all, including herself. The weeks that followed felt different in ways neither of them tried to name out loud. Nathaniel started appearing in the kitchen most mornings before Mrs. Abernathy arrived, making coffee for two instead of one, waiting until Emily sat down before he'd let himself drink his own. He didn't say much some mornings. He was simply there, which turned out to matter far more than either of them expected. One afternoon he called her into the library, the same room where the scarf had first been found, though neither of them mentioned that out loud. He told her he was having the entire book collection reorganized and restored. Some volumes needed repair, others could probably be sold or donated, and he wanted her to make the decisions about what stayed and what didn't. "I trust your judgment," he said simply, for words that landed heavier than any apology could have. Snow kept falling steadily through most of December, blanketing the grounds of Hawthorne Manor in a soft, forgiving white that made even the coldest mornings feel a little gentler than they should have. Emily found herself lingering by the tall windows some evenings just to watch it come down, thinking about how much had changed since she'd first walked up that gravel drive for weeks earlier expecting nothing but another quiet job to survive. Nathaniel established the scholarship almost without telling anyone, working quietly through the Graham Property Group's charitable foundation to fund a nursing program at the state university. And when the paperwork crossed his desk requiring a first recipient's name, he wrote Emily's without asking her permission first, the same way she'd left notes by the coffee machine without asking his. He told her about it on a Sunday evening in front of the fireplace in the smaller sitting room, the one that had never been used in years before she'd started lighting fires in it out of habit. She sat frozen for a long moment holding the folder he'd handed her, reading the words twice to make sure she understood them correctly, her eyes filling before she could stop them, this time from something that felt entirely different than fear. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice thick. "Because you cover people with blankets even when you think nobody's watching," he said simply, "and because the world needs more of whatever that is in you. And because I would like, very much, for you to stay somewhere in my life even after this house no longer needs a housekeeper." Something in his voice on that last part had gone quiet and unguarded in a way she'd never heard from him before. She stayed 4 more weeks after that conversation, long enough to see the last heavy snowfall of the season blanket the maple tree in the courtyard until its bare branches looked almost soft. They shared dinner together most nights by then, no roles between them anymore. Just two people talking about her mother's slow improvement, his mother's old stories about building this house, the strange particular question of whether happiness was something you earned or something that simply happened to you. On her final morning, Nathaniel woke early and made coffee and waited. When Emily came down with her small suitcase already packed by the door, he stayed seated at the table, watching her carefully. "The bus leaves at 9, she said. He nodded slowly, then stood and retrieved something small from the shelf above the window, a thin silver bracelet, unadorned except for one engraved snowflake, worn soft with age. It was my mother's, he said without further explanation. She wore it every single day of her life that I can remember. Emily held it in her palm a long moment, turning it over in the morning light. I can't accept this, she said quietly. Yes, he said simply, you can. She swallowed hard and slipped it into her coat pocket. And when the taxi pulled up the gravel drive 20 minutes later, Nathaniel stood in the open doorway of Hawthorne Manor and watched her go. Come back, he said as she reached the car, not as a question and not quite as a request either. Just a plain fact laid out between them the way he might state the terms of an agreement he had no intention of renegotiating. She didn't answer. She only looked at him a moment longer than necessary before climbing into the taxi, and he stood there in the cold long after the car had disappeared down the road toward town. She almost didn't go back. For weeks after returning to Stowe, she told herself the distance between a man like Nathaniel Graham and a woman who had grown up counting quarters for the laundromat was not the kind of thing a silver bracelet could fix, no matter how gently it had been given. She was afraid of becoming someone's rescue story, a good deed he could point to and feel better about himself for, rather than someone he actually wanted sitting across the breakfast table for the next 40 years. Her mother, sitting up in bed with color back in her cheeks for the first time in 2 years, was the one who finally said it plainly one evening while Emily folded laundry and avoided the subject for the third night running. You've spent your whole life making yourself small so nobody would have a reason to hurt you, her mother said, and it kept you safe. But safe isn't the same thing as happy, and you already know the difference. You're just scared to say it out loud. 6 months passed. The snow melted from the grounds of Hawthorne Manor, and the bare maple tree in the courtyard filled slowly with new green leaves. And for the first time in years, Nathaniel found himself putting fresh-cut flowers on windowsills without entirely knowing why he bothered. He told himself it didn't mean anything in particular. He kept doing it anyway, every single week, whether anyone else noticed or not. On a Tuesday afternoon in early May, he was outside inspecting the new growth on the hedges when he heard the gate creak open behind him. He didn't turn right away, not certain his ears weren't simply inventing the sound out of habit. Then a voice he hadn't stopped thinking about for half a year said the hedges were growing crooked on the east side, and he turned to find Emily Carver standing on the gravel path with a canvas bag over one shoulder. He crossed the distance between them in a handful of long strides and stopped just short of her, unsure suddenly what a man like him was supposed to do with hands that had learned, slowly, how to hold on to things. She reached into her bag and pulled out something small wrapped in cloth, pressing it into his palm without a word. He unwrapped it carefully and found the silver bracelet, the one he'd given her the morning she left. I'm bringing it back, she said, watching his face carefully, but not because I didn't want it. I'm bringing it back so that I'd have a reason to come find you again. For a moment, he simply stared at her, and then he laughed, loud and unguarded, and entirely unlike the composed man everyone in 3 counties believed him to be, a sound Mrs. Abernathy would later swear she hadn't heard out of him since before his mother passed. That evening they stood together in the kitchen the way they had all those months before, him washing, her drying. No roles left standing between them anymore. Nothing but 2 people who had discovered that decency doesn't announce itself with fanfare, that some of the truest kindness in the world happens quietly, in a room where nobody's watching, in the shape of a blanket laid gently over someone's shoulders. Nathaniel found himself thinking, as he dried his hands on the kitchen towel, about that first afternoon on the couch, eyes shut, waiting to see what kind of person Emily Carver really was underneath all her careful silence. He'd gone looking for proof that people could be dishonest when they thought nobody was watching. What he'd found instead was proof of something far rarer, that some people are good simply because it's who they are, with no audience required and no reward expected. He understood now that he'd spent years searching for exactly that quality in boardrooms and business partners, in polished, well-spoken people who said all the right things and meant almost none of it. He'd finally found it in a woman with a plain gray coat and a crooked embroidered initial on an old scarf, someone who refused tips and covered strangers with blankets and never once asked for anything in return, simply because that was who she was. Emily set the last dried plate onto the shelf and leaned against the counter, watching him. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He looked at her a long moment. something soft and certain in his expression that had taken 39 years to arrive at. "I'm thinking," he said, "that I built an entire test around whether I could trust you, and you passed it without ever once trying. And I've been trying to be worthy of that ever since." Outside, the last of the spring rain had turned briefly to a light, unseasonable flurry of snow, drifting gently past the kitchen window and dissolving against the warm glass before it ever reached the ground, as though winter itself had come back one final time just to see how the story turned out. Nathaniel crossed the kitchen and reached for her hand, carefully, the way a man reaches for something he still can't quite believe he's allowed to hold. Leave a comment before you go. If you were Emily, standing in that mudroom with the whole world deciding you were guilty before you'd said a word, would you have kept quiet the way she did, or would you have fought to make them listen? And if you enjoyed spending this winter evening with us, don't forget to subscribe to Winter Veil, because there is always another story waiting just past the snow.